everybody. We are at the June 19th session of the Freedom Hub Working Group. Excited to have you here today. We got another great speaker today for us. We had a great time last week with Lawrence Reed when he ran through all of the various presidents and so on, and all of what that was like between the good ones and the bad ones and so on. So it was pretty exciting to hear. And today we're going to definitely cover another interesting topic about shipping and transportation within the country and things we assume is already handled, and what's to talk about. But as it turns out, there's quite a bit. And also just to forewarn everybody that this session is recorded. We release the recordings every Monday, so there'll be a notice that goes out that tells you what's coming up for that coming Wednesday. And we're going to go a quick run through on some of those people coming up to give you a taste, as well as a link to the recording of the one that just passed, which would be today in this example. And usually at the bottom we'll also show a couple of best ofs from other sessions that you might have missed, so we can get you a chance to check out some of the stuff, because it's as timely as the one we're having today as the one we had 6 months ago is just as timely, because we're talking about issues that are burning a hole in everybody's situation, and we all need to be addressing them. So don't discount anything we've got here just because maybe it's a couple months old already. They're not necessarily topically driven. And then also, if you want to invite others, this is the links that you're going to want to give out. So this is the link for the sessions that we're on right now. So it's a bit.ly/Freedom Hub Working Group, and that's all in caps. And then also we have our video channel, which is where some of those links will take you when it's offering those ones from the past. And you can see here real quick that we've got quite a number of videos posted already. So I'd certainly encourage you to come on in here and share these and check out some of the ones you haven't seen, because I have to tell you, there's not a bad one in the bunch, and not trying to sound biased or anything in that regard. So today we're going to first have Charles give us a little rundown on who's coming up in the next couple weeks, and then we're going to have him do a little bit of a setup on our guest today, Joe Kent. So Charles, if you'll do the honors there.
Certainly, Jeff, and welcome everyone. It's exciting to have Joe talk about the Jones Act, because as localized as it appears to be, because it's island type states, depending on imports, that seem to suffer the most from the domestic protectionism for water shipping. But as Joe will tell you, repeal of this act and allowing foreign competitors to our domestic local shipping will light up the waterways. So much of what is shipped on trucks now could be shipped on barges. So it could become a safety issue, less trucks on the road and more stuff shipped on barges, opening up a lot of jobs, opportunity along all the coastlines of our country. And we're going to continue the transportation theme next week as our preview coming guest with a well-known libertarian, Bob Poole from the Reason Foundation, who for decades has specialized on private partnerships on privatizing roads. And then we're going to go to a presidential candidate, Adam Kokesh, who's going to talk about his campaign platform to localize everything. People always characterize it as abolishing the federal government, which it would do. But it's a big picture kind of educational campaign on how the world would look if we localized everything. And in 3 weeks, we'll have financial deregulation as an important point to talk about the financial crash that might be coming our way with round 2 of the Great Recession. We'll have John Berlau from the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And finally, in a month, we'll have the Professor Art Carden on, big picture, why do we have any limits at all from government on anything we do? So that's the preview, Jeff.
Fantastic. All right, well, I'm going to give Joe the floor here. This is their organization, Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, and I'm going to give him control of the screen here, and he'll kind of take us through what he's doing, a little bit on his background and what they're all about here with this program and how it really impacts all of us, and we didn't even really know it was a problem. So Joe, hold on a moment here. You can kind of begin talking, and here comes your prompt.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff Cantor and Charles Froman. I really appreciate you reaching out. And it's an honor to talk at the Freedom Hub Working Group with the luminaries, the other luminaries that you have on your roster. So this is a great experience, so thank you. Today, my presentation is finding common ground on the Jones Act. And first, a little bit about me. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, and we are a free market think tank based in Hawaii, obviously, and basically the only free market institution around in the state. And about me, my background is I was a public school teacher for many years, and you know, a big government thinker. I thought the government was the solution to all our problems, and then I read a bit of Hayek and Rothbard and Mises, and they really changed my mind. And so I jumped ship from teaching kids, and now I'm helping to teach adults and everyone in Hawaii about a lot of the problems that we face, especially economically. And one of the biggest problems in Hawaii is that are talked about with respect to the economy is the Jones Act. And you know, it's a little known law across the United States, but in Hawaii, a lot of people know it well. I mean, it's like you know, just well known. You ask anyone on the street, have you ever heard of the Jones Act? And they know what you're talking about here, because everything has to be shipped to Hawaii. We ship in about 98% of the goods to the state, and all of that shipping is higher cost because of the Jones Act. Now, what is the Jones Act? Well, the Jones Act is formerly known as the Section 27 of the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. It's also known as a cabotage law, but basically it requires all goods, you know, transported by water between U.S. ports to be carried on a ship built in the U.S., registered in the U.S., and owned and crewed by U.S. citizens. And so this, you know, significantly increases the price of shipping because of the protectionism involved. This basically makes it, for example, illegal for a foreign ship to pick up cargo in Hawaii bound for California, for example. And it would, you know, similarly be illegal for a foreign ship to pick up cargo in Puerto Rico, and if that cargo is bound for Florida, for example, even if that ship stopped in the Dominican Republic halfway through. So, so the ship, I mean, the Jones Act basically gets in the way of a lot of, you know, the shipping activity between U.S. states. And again, that costs America a lot. And how much are we talking about here? Well, a recent study showed that the Jones Act, you know, getting rid of the Jones Act would be a $64 billion boon to the U.S. GDP, and a $19 billion boom if it were just the ship build requirement, if that were exempted. And that's according to the OECD, I think last month. And the Cato Institute estimates that it's between $40 billion and $113 billion per year. So that's a lot of money we're talking about. And if you just zoom in on Puerto Rico, the costs just for Puerto Rico are estimated to be you know, about $1.1 billion higher than they otherwise would be, just, you know, for consumer prices. And shipping costs are about $500 million higher, and that robs Puerto Rico of about 13,000 jobs and $300 million in wages and $1.5 billion in economic activity. And you get the point. It's a lot of money we're talking about annually. How much does it cost Hawaii? Actually, nobody really knows for sure what it costs Hawaii, because there's never been a study on the economic costs specifically of the Jones Act on Hawaii. But you know, it's not unreasonable to assume that the cost could be, you know, in the ballpark of Puerto Rico. So, and in other words, billions of dollars. So that is a price that is paid largely by, you know, the you know, Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, and Guam, basically states that aren't on the mainland, because we're always having to ship. So how does the Jones Act make prices higher? You know, what does it actually do that makes the prices higher? Well, basically, it just keeps foreign competition out. I mean, it's just classic protectionism. And that leads to increased prices. So, for example, let's look at Hawaii. And if you can see my screen here, basically, if you have ships from the Asia wanting to go to the U.S., it's a common misconception that those ships could go to, if the Jones Act were repealed or something, that those ships would come down to Hawaii and bring goods over here. But actually, what happens is it doesn't look like it on the map, but it's actually a shorter distance from Asia to America across this great circle up here because of the spherical nature of the Earth. So, so actually, a lot of researchers say that if the Jones Act were reformed, we wouldn't see any more, foreign shipping in the Hawaiian Islands, because that would be so far out of the way of the Asian ships. And that might be true. So it affects Hawaii, though, in a different way. The Jones Act affects Hawaii in a very different way. And that's by monopolizing our ports. And there's a monopolistic effect of the Jones Act, which is that it costs so much to build these Jones Act ships that it keeps competitors out. So, for example, a Jones Act ship, built in America, can cost 3 or 4 or 5 times as much as the international ship pricing. And so there was actually a ship that wanted to enter the Hawaii market, and a shipping carrier that wanted to enter the Hawaii market, and they pulled out at the last second, Tote, and it was in 2017. They wanted to enter the Hawaii market, but the cost of buying 4 new ships and entering the market was too high, and so they pulled out. And that's a classic story in Hawaii. So then we're just left with the 2 companies, Matson and Pasha, that have held dominance in Hawaii for years, and that raises our prices. So in Hawaii, the Jones Act affects us a bit differently than it does, for example, on the West Coast or Alaska, because we're so far out of the way, but it still reaches its claws into our island and makes our cost of living higher. And so that has resulted in some kind of crazy things happening. So, for example, Hawaii cattlemen transport their cattle through Canada rather than directly to the West Coast because of the high cost of the Jones Act. And sometimes they even transport their cattle by plane if the price is right. So, and that's a direct effect of the higher prices of the Jones Act. In addition, Hawaii ships, I think, almost all of its crude oil from Indonesia and the Pacific Rim because it's just more cost effective to do so. It costs so much to ship it straight from the mainland. And how much does it cost? Well, the Cato Institute showed that the Jones Act tanker costs about $100,000 per day, compared to a foreign tanker, which costs only about $10,000 per day. So that's a significant cost difference, and it actually, it actually hurts suppliers of oil on the mainland. So in a roundabout way, the Jones Act affects Texas and other American suppliers. And this might be one reason why Hawaii has the highest electricity costs in the nation, because we aren't able to get more competitive energy sources. In addition, Hawaii also ships all of its natural gas from foreign sources because there are no Jones Act vessels that can ship liquid natural gas. So again, that increases our high cost of living and our high electricity costs. Now, it doesn't just affect Hawaii, though. The Jones Act also affects the mainland, and that's because the Jones Act applies, and some people forget, the Jones Act applies to ships traveling up and down the coasts. So, if a ship wanted to travel from California to Seattle, for example, and pick up goods from California and drop them off in Seattle, it would have to be on a Jones Act ship, and that makes it more expensive to do things like ship road salt. And there was a story a few years ago where some mid-Atlantic states needed to import road salt all the way from Chile and Mexico rather than buying it from Ohio and Louisiana because of the cost of the Jones Act. Same thing with grain farmers in the Midwest. They have to make do with only 2 dry bulk Jones Act ships to ship their products on. And also, it's 2 times more costly to ship oil from Texas to New York than it is to ship from Texas to Canada. And so, yeah, the Jones Act really does affect the mainland a lot. After all, the mainland ships more than Hawaii and Puerto Rico. I mean, the Texas and Louisiana ship way, way more than Hawaii, and they pay a premium for that Jones Act price. That's why the OECD says zapping the Jones Act would lead to a $64 billion boon, not just to Hawaii or Alaska, but for the entire nation. But there's never been a state-by-state study to show exactly how much it would cost every state, and that is a problem because that means folks on the mainland don't actually know how much the Jones Act affects them. And they think, oh, it's just that little Hawaii law, or it's just that little Puerto Rico law or something. They don't realize it's actually a federal law that affects their pocketbook as well. So if you'll excuse me just a second. So where did the Jones Act come from? Well, the Jones Act was named after its sponsor, Senator Wesley Jones, and he said he wanted to build up and maintain an adequate American merchant marine. In other words, an adequate commercial shipping industry. And he kind of packaged it and sold it as a way to help protect the military. But it actually appears that he might have been trying to protect the American shipping industries from foreign competition. And to that end, the law worked. I mean, it's a protectionist law. And immediately after it was passed, the Canadian ships that were sailing up and down the West Coast stopped servicing that market in the same way. And the 2 remaining shipping lines in Senator Wesley Jones' home state of Washington benefited from from the monopoly that was produced. So it's just overtly protectionist. Now, the Jones Act is also a protectionist law that keeps foreign competition out, but it also keeps local competition out. As I mentioned in Hawaii, it monopolizes the Hawaii market even from American shipping carriers, and so it's such a strong protectionist law that it's actually protecting the shipping industry to death in a way. And the shipping industry is in decline. I mean, the Jones Act has been in place throughout this decades-long decline of the shipping industry. And how much has the shipping industry declined? Well, if you just look at Jones Act domestic trade ships, they've gone down from about 500 just before 1950 to only about 100 today. And that's because the price of building those ships has gone up. It used to be about 20% higher than the international market, and now it's about 4 to 5 times more expensive than the internationally built ships. And so we're getting less orders. We used to produce ships for other countries, and now we only produce them for ourselves. And that's resulted in a dampened shipping industry. Employment has almost gone down by half since then, and we've had about 300 shipyards closed since 1980s. And today there's only four major shipyards that produce the big commercial ocean-going ships for the Jones Act fleet, and they employ less than 10,000 workers. So we're really talking about a law that basically protects the shipbuilding industry, which is about 10,000 workers, and the crews. But just focusing on the crews, the law hurts them too, because fewer ships mean fewer jobs for crew members as well. And so again, the law is protecting the industry to death. So we're trying to make this argument to you know, the industry advocates as well, that if they really want a long-term sustainable industry, then they should be for Jones Act reform or repeal. Now, the OECD even said that if we were to zap the Jones Act, then it would force shipbuilders to be sustainable in the long term. I mean, they'd have to compete with the foreign built ships. Of course, if the Jones Act, let's say the shipbuilding exemption, for example, let's say the shipbuilding requirement were repealed, and you didn't have to build ships in America, then if that were to happen, it would hurt a lot of shipbuilding jobs. I mean, a lot of people would go out of business probably, but in the long term, they would be better off because they would be sustainable. They'd be forced to be sustainable and compete on and lower their prices basically. So so they can sink or swim, but if that were to happen, it could benefit a lot of people, and it could even benefit union crews, for example, because that would open up the market to more to less expensive ships, and that would be more shipping, and that would lead to more jobs for crew members, and maybe even more jobs for ship maintenance workers and so on. So it's just an interesting phenomenon of how the law is actually you know, protecting its own industry too much in a way. Now the Jones Act was sold as a way to build a large shipping industry, and of course we've seen that hasn't happened as much. But it was also built as a way to protect the military, for something called military sea lift. And military sea lift is the idea that basically the US shipping industry could help the US military in a time of need. So let's say that there was a war and we suddenly needed to transport a lot of goods overseas. Well, then the US shipping industry, the theory goes that the US shipping industry could transport those goods overseas for military operations. The problem with that idea is that the Jones Act is almost never used for overseas military operations. And Grassroot Institute did an open records request to the administration and asking for any time that a Jones Act ship has ever been used for an overseas military operation. And they basically gave us one example, and it's the same example that they always give, which is one Jones Act ship that was used to transport vehicles and cargo to Iraq during, after the Iraq War. So it doesn't really seem like they're using it that much if they could only find this one example. And that's because they use other fleets to transport cargo instead. They mostly use the Maritime Security Program fleet and the Ready Reserve Force fleet, which are American ships, but they're built overseas. So they're internationally built, foreign-built ships that transport goods for the U.S. military overseas. And the military does use Jones Act ships to transport goods between U.S. ports, but it does so at a higher cost. It pays the Jones Act premium. So presumably the military does not use Jones Act ships overseas because they're too expensive. So in a way, you could say that the Jones Act actually hinders the military, which is interesting because one of the main, if you read the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, also known as the Jones Act, it starts, it is necessary for the national defense. So, that's how it was sold, is to protect national defense. So that claim is a bit dubious. But you could say, well, don't we need the Jones Act in an emergency? I mean, okay, we don't need to go overseas with U.S. ships, but maybe we need the Jones Act to help, let's say, if a hurricane hits, Hawaii or Puerto Rico or something. Well, that doesn't sound right because they often waive the Jones Act during an emergency. You may remember that in Puerto Rico, they were hit by a hurricane in 2017, and the Trump administration waived the Jones Act for 20 days to help with emergency supplies. And there were actually 10 foreign ships that used that Jones Act waiver to help deliver supplies. But Puerto Rico needed the waiver for a longer period of time. It's too bad that it was only 20 days because the island was and is still paying high shipping costs to get goods to their shores. And in Hawaii, we often bite our nails when there's a hurricane because we can't just, drive over goods from Iowa or something. We have to ship it in. And that makes us nervous. And back in, last year, 2018, we had a hurricane scare. There was something, Hurricane Lane was approaching the islands and everybody was terrified. And the Grassroot Institute, actually, we submitted a waiver request to the administration asking to waive the Jones Act to help us with the hurricane. But the hurricane missed us just barely, which we're thankful for. And but it still begs the question about what would happen if a hurricane were to hit. Jones Act ships don't have the cranes. A lot of Jones Act ships don't have the cranes that can offload directly from the ships to the land. And so they have to go to Honolulu Harbor, where those cranes exist. And so that would tie up supplies in Honolulu Harbor during an emergency. And that could be devastating for people, especially on the neighbor islands, who would be waiting for cargo. So the Jones Act, gets in the way of the military. It gets in the way, it might hinder the military. It might hinder response to emergencies. It might probably hinders our cost of living. But there's also environmental costs to this as well. Jones Act ships are so costly to build. Remember, we've got these high costs that it's just very expensive, and they're used long after their life cycle. And so if you look at the average age of the US fleet, that's about, 33 years versus the foreign fleet at less than 15 years. So the Jones Act fleet is often, they're old ships, they're rickety. Some of them are new, but a lot of them are old, and that can cause dangers like it did in the El Faro disaster. That was a Jones Act ship that was 40 years old, and it sunk in 2015 and resulted in the loss of 33 lives. A federal investigation found that the ship's old age was a contributing factor to the ship sinking. Also, in the Exxon Valdez disaster, which was one of the worst oil spills in American history, that was done on a Jones Act ship. And actually, the Jones Act often gets in the way of oil spill cleanups where foreign ships could help us. It kind of sometimes gets in the way and sometimes has to be waived just so that they can help clean up that disaster. Also, the Jones Act gums up traffic across the US because of all of the trucking that happens. That trucking could happen on ships. I mean, the trucking transportation, the cargo could be transported on ships, but because of the Jones Act, there are more trucks going up and down the coasts, and that adds to traffic pollution and traffic congestion. Truck and rail produce more carbon emissions than ships do. So many people might not realize that ships are actually a very clean form of transportation. So, we've got the cost of living, we've got the environment, we have emergencies, and the Jones Act might even hinder the military. So the Jones Act has a lot of harm. It does a lot of harm to not just Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Alaska, but to the rest of the US. So what should we do? Well, a lot of people talk about repealing the Jones Act. Let's repeal the Jones Act because that's the only thing that makes sense, and just get rid of it. That's probably a good idea, but there's a political problem with that, which is that the Jones Act is a classic public choice problem where you have a focused special interest who believe they benefit from this, and there are dispersed costs for this. So the guy sitting in Iowa on his couch, doesn't have any incentive to get up off the couch and donate hundreds of thousands of dollars to a congressman to repeal the Jones Act. So that is the main problem with the Jones Act, that it's just very entrenched. And so some people have floated some other ideas. Maybe we should do a waiver, like a long waiver, like a year-long waiver or a forever waiver or something to Puerto Rico. And that's been talked about and shot down, but it's been talked about. It might be a good idea to talk about that for Hawaii too, by the way, and that would be interesting. But the most politically possible way to reform the Jones Act would be with a U.S. build exemption. If you remember, the Jones Act, requires that ships that transport goods from one port to another port in the United States are built in the U.S., flagged in the U.S., and crewed and owned mostly by Americans. And if you just repealed the build exemption, then we could sail with foreign-built ships, just like we do with foreign-built cars. We drive them, and we use foreign-built planes and foreign-built rail cars and so on. So also we should be able to use foreign-built ships. And as I mentioned before, that may have long-term benefits, short-term costs, but long-term benefits to the shipbuilding industry itself, who would be forced to compete according to the OECD. So repealing or reforming the Jones Act could be very painful in the short term, but again, more sustainable in the long term. But more importantly, it would also bring down costs for consumers who are maybe trying to buy a gallon of milk. It could help our environment, and it could help get out of the way of emergencies, and it would reduce costs for the military. So sounds like a good idea, right? Well, only one problem is politics. And if you look at the lobbying efforts by the shipping industry, the sea transport industry gives a lot of money to congressmen and presidential candidates. And so, like, for example, if I go to 2016, the sea transport industry gave, let's see, $155,000 to Hillary Clinton and $102,000 to Donald Trump. And they give money to both political parties, Democrats and Republicans. And a lot of the people who receive the money are key members of the key committees that would need to talk about, repealing or reforming the law. So that is the big hurdle here. And that's why we're so intent on trying to talk about, the benefits of reforming the Jones Act, even for the industry itself. So if you guys can help with that, if you folks are on the mainland or something, we would love your help in this as well, to help educate more about the Jones Act.
Joe, that was pretty interesting, and it is easy to see how diffused these things are to the average person, but yet how much is permeating everything. And I can only wonder what it would be like in general if this stuff was done away with or never had started where we'd be today. It'd be probably a pretty amazing place. Like any of this type of stuff, it almost needs you need a groundswell of people to kind of force the issue, because no politician's going to make the move. There doesn't seem to be anything in it for anybody to do anything. How do we get everybody in, like what's happening in Hawaii? How have you been able to grow what you're doing just from the people of the islands becoming involved and translate that to the regular contiguous states? Well,
Hawaii is a special case. I mean, we're almost the poster child, along with Puerto Rico, for the Jones Act, and we're very good at coming up with stories about how it hurts us. I mean, there's a rum business owner in Kauai who often talks about how the Jones Act hurts his business, and many businesses across the state. And so we need those stories. Same thing with Puerto Rico. We need the stories about how it actually impacts folks who are trying to build their life again after a hurricane. But the problem with these stories is it further solidifies in the minds of folks on the mainland that the Jones Act is just, oh, that little Hawaii problem, and not my problem type of thing. So unless folks on the mainland actually know how much the Jones Act affects them, and specifically their states and their industries, even more importantly, then otherwise there will be no incentive to reform the Jones Act, because after all, it is a federal law. It's not a state of Hawaii law or anything. So that's why we need more research on, how much does the Jones Act cost Louisiana, or how much does the Jones Act cost even, Minnesota, or, inland states and everything. And without that research, though, there's just no way to inspire industries or anything like that. But preliminary look has shown that it actually does cost a lot of industries, like the logging industry, the oil industry, and food industry and agriculture and everything. So there's great opportunity here actually for someone to dig that up.
It would seem that a natural ally for you would be the state of California, because they have such a long coast themselves, and the fact that, you guys are facing each other, as it were. So if you were able to get similar stories like you described in Hawaii that were happening to West Coast individuals, businesses, and shippers, that'd be a way to kind of proliferate it, because without a cavalcade of stories, and I see what you mean by just, the Puerto Rican and Hawaiian type issues. So that alone's a pretty good starting point, but you need some, domestic, as it were, people here. Have you got any toehold in California or anywhere to kind of, treat that as a great opening place? I mean, if you could find a Louisiana or someone else would fall in your lap, great. But if you're going to target your efforts, California seems like a low-hanging fruit.
No, actually, we unfortunately we don't have any friends in California that I'm aware of that are with us on the Jones Act. And if you look back at the lobbying efforts, California does have a lot of money flowing to it through lobbyists, basically. So but that's a great point, though. I mean, maybe there is a case to be made where the Jones Act should be reformed, even from a Californian perspective.
Even if it was with some sort of think tank like Cato, or even an operation like Capital Research Center, which is kind of into that types of stuff, would be a good place to maybe help get in the middle to sort of put those parties together.
Well, yeah, that's right. And Cato Institute, and I should say a lot of this research today is, I stand on the shoulders of giants like Michael Hansen and others at the Cato Institute who have worked on this for years. And Cato is doing a great job at compiling all this research. And I think they're doing a lot of the cost research themselves. So it'll be really interesting to see what they come up with in the next few years.
Yeah, there will be. Let's try to bring some of the crew in here a little bit. I see, Kishore, you've got your hand up.
So recently, there was an effort to remove the Jones Act for transportation to Massachusetts, and they've been working on a long-term waiver as a prelude to actually repealing the Jones Act. It's not quite clear why it originated in Massachusetts. Maybe you know better. So I wanted to understand what is the impetus to get started on it right now.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that actually, and I'll have to look into that. But I do know that there was a waiver that was floated, I think this year, and I think the Trump administration was talking about doing a long-term waiver for Puerto Rico. So I don't know if it's related in any way, but people were talking about, I think 2 months ago, that was a big issue. And then it just died. I'm not sure what happened. Maybe the industry insiders got a hold of Trump and decided to scare him from doing that. But I'll have to look.
In the case of Massachusetts, it's really the natural gas, transportation of natural gas. That is the immediate reason for doing this. But I guess there'll be other states which need to transport natural gas also. So why only Massachusetts?
Oh, well, that's a good point about natural gas. I mean, as I mentioned before, there are no Jones Act ships that transport natural gas right now. And, the industry experts are scrambling to figure out how to get a Jones Act ship that does that or get around it or something. So, yeah, that's probably what it's related to.
Somewhere else there's added costs along the way there. Great. Charles, I see you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Jeff. And Joe, what struck me when we discussed this when I was working with Governor Johnson's nonprofit was that talking points you mentioned about excessive trucks on the road who may not be there but for the Jones Act, where some of that cargo could be shipped on barges or ships along our coastlines. To me, that seems to be a big selling point for folks who care about this issue, to get the trucks off the road, to get the barges going along the sea lanes. What kind of response have you gotten from that painting of a picture?
Yeah, that's right. You know, it's something that a lot of people don't think about is how much the shipping actually affects trucking. But the Cato Institute actually launched a billboard campaign that says, "Stuck in traffic? Blame the Jones Act." Learn more at blamethejonesact.com. So, and there was a study done in the European Union where they actually, so these laws are called maritime cabotage laws. And, you know, the Jones Act is a maritime cabotage law, and the European Union relaxed their maritime cabotage laws, and there was a study that showed that actually decreased the trucking on the roads and increased the amount of shipped traffic. So, so yeah, you know, who knows how much we could see in terms of less traffic congestion, and actually congestion's bad, but it's also important to remember that we're paying a higher price for that traffic as well, in terms of inflated costs for transportation.
Guy, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi Joe, this is Guy Monahan. And,
oh, hi Guy.
Hi, how you doing?
Good, good.
So you were talking about California earlier, and I was thinking of the Independent Institute. And David and Mary Thoreau might be very interested in this. I don't know if you've contacted them.
Well, I've talked to them before, but not about this, and I think that's a great idea. I mean, you know, in Hawaii, it's so easy to get we're on an island here, and as you know, you just get rock fever here. So we really do need to get out to the other states, and actually, you know, reform of the Jones Act isn't going to start or end with just the Grassroot Institute. It's going to take, you know, the Cato Institute, which we're happy that they're involved, and as you said, the Independent Institute. But particularly to California, I agree with you that there's such a great opportunity there to make good arguments.
Yeah, that's all I had.
Mm-hmm.
No, and one little interesting sidebar, this is why we call it the Freedom Hub Working Group. We're definitely trying to get to some solutions by having these types of people be on these calls. So we encourage you to induce others, because it's going to always, and invariably on these calls, it's always amazing. It comes down to all of us individually on this call, and every person. We got to fix this. Nothing ever is helping us ever, except if we figure out how to help each other and together. So this is really great. David, I see that your hand is up there too.
Thanks, Jeff. Joe, this is David Demarest with Roads to Freedom in Omaha. Since the Jones Act directly or indirectly impacts all citizens, it sounds like we need stories about the impact to inland folks as well as folks on the coast. I'm friends with the Platt Institute in Omaha. They're about removing barriers for Nebraskans, primarily protectionist regulations. I'd like to connect you with the Platt Institute, if that's okay with you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. And I've talked to we're a member of the State Policy Network, just like the Platt Institute is. But I think you're right that Middle America, especially farmers, need to get on board with this issue, because they pay higher prices for transporting grain and crops and other goods. A lot of that is shipped on Jones Act ships, and so absolutely. And plus, you know, if you look at the Mississippi River, a lot of those ships are also Jones Act ships. Actually, I think all of those ships are Jones Act ships, and that's Middle America too. Although the shipbuild exemption, I should say, would not affect those ships because those are mostly tugboats and barges and things, whereas the shipbuild exemption would apply, you know, as stated by Michael Hansen anyways, just to deep draft ocean-going cargo ships. So there's a lot of nuance in all of this.
Would it affect the ships that travel the Great Lakes?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The Great Lakes shipping, like to Michigan, for example, that's Jones Act trade if it goes from one U.S. port to another U.S. port. So yeah, that's another great point.
I know that Cleveland, which is where I'm located, is a huge resource for salt. It's located under the Lake Erie, and so they mine quite a bit of it and ship it all over the place. So, you know, everybody's bearing this unnecessary cost. It's just such a shame when you think of how much better the economy and everything would be in general. All these little, it's like driving around with the emergency brake on your car all day.
Jeff?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, go ahead, Charles.
Joe, paint me a picture. I use that verbiage there again. How much more ship and barge traffic with repeal or waiver extension of the Jones Act have you envisioned, as long as you've worked on this issue? What would the waterways of the U.S. up the rivers into the middle of the country, how would it change? What does this picture look like?
Well, that is a question that I struggle with a lot. You know, as we try to do economic analyses of these, you know, it's a very tricky question because basically you have to guesstimate what would happen. And, you know, I don't know if you have read Hayek, but basically there's something called the fatal conceit in these types of, you know, calculations where, you know, we can try to assume or guess what happens, but actually nobody knows what would happen if a law were like that were reformed. Like, for example, there's the idea that ships would still continue to skip Hawaii, or would they? You know, maybe would more ships come to Hawaii? And does Hawaii even have the right port capacity to take in those ships? And do we even need all those ships? And so there's a lot of questions, and it's just a big web across the United States to try to study this. So, you know, the best that we can do is guess, but there's nothing wrong with guessing, actually. You know, if you said, for example, that if the Jones Act repeal increased the volume of shipping by 1%, what would that increase the GDP by, for example? I mean, there's nothing wrong with asking that question.
Do you have any speculation? I mean, to get to Charles's question, as it were, would it suddenly double the amount of shipping in the States? Or, I mean, because I can imagine, I'm sitting here in Cleveland, so we have the Cuyahoga River, and there's all kinds of shipping that goes on up and down that thing. And especially when you made your argument, or not even this argument, I should say, but actual point of fact that, you know, we're using international everything here, from airplanes to cars, to imagine we're not doing ships that's like foolhardy and so backwards that at the very least, forget the whole Jones Act, why are we not at least doing that? So if that opened up, I can imagine that, you know, in Cleveland as an example, they would be able to pick up the shipping business quite a bit with all that added cost savings and so on. Plus, how much difference would there be in price of tugs and some other, you know, boats they could use?
Yeah, no, I wish I could guesstimate about, you know, would it double, would it triple, or anything like that. But you know, I'll save that for the economists who study this. And you know, but we can say that there would be more. I mean, that is the one thing that you can say, that there'd be more competition, that prices would go down. How much, I really don't know.
I wonder what Paul Krugman has to say on the matter.
Yeah, I don't know if they've ever heard him talk about this.
Oh, hardly. It would be hysterical.
Here's a question, Jeff, unless anyone else has raised their hand.
No, you're
Are
good.
there any related laws to the Jones Act that you would change or repeal to enhance the effect of Jones Act repeal, to sort of help that picture show more shipping going on the waterways?
Yeah, sure. Well, that's a great question, and there is, you know, so the Jones Act is a shipping cabotage law that applies a lot to cargo ships, but there's another law called the Dredging Act, I think, and that protects the dredging industry, and it says that any ship that dredges you know, in a similar fashion, needs to be U.S. built and U.S. owned and everything else too. There's another law, I guess it's called colloquially the airline cabotage law, and it says that any airplane that you know, travels between U.S. ports has to be you know, U.S. crewed and owned and all of that and registered too. So, you know, cabotage exists in a lot of different transportation industries, and it's worth asking the question, if we just got rid of all those cabotage laws, would we see lower prices for airfares as well? I mean, would they have to compete even more with shipping and rail and trucking and all the rest of it? So.
Quick follow-up, if I might, Jeff. That's a pet issue of mine, Joe. I go by these regional airports like Hagerstown, Western Maryland, really nice, or here in Williamsburg. Wouldn't repeal of airline cabotage, let the foreign flyers come in, just you know, make something special out of these underutilized regional airports, cut prices, and really give customers a lot more options? That to me is a huge issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And maybe we could pay lower costs to visit our families, you know, somewhere else in the U.S. And yeah, absolutely, that would probably bring down costs. But then you'd have to deal with a lot of the security fears about, oh, we have foreigners coming to our countries and going from airport to airport and everything. Well, you know, foreign workers can and do come to U.S. airports. They just can't go from port to port. And the same is true with Jones Act ships. It's important to remember that you know, international crews can and do stop in U.S. shipping ports. They just can't go, you know, pick up cargo bound for another U.S. shipping port. But you know, we see them all the time.
Well, that was pretty interesting on that level too. There's so many machinations out there. It is pretty incredible how interwoven everything we're doing is. Charles, we've run out of time here today, so Joe, I want to thank you and everybody else for being here, and we're going to resume with another exciting episode next week. So again, Charles, on the way out, if you want to kind of give us a fast overview, and we'll say goodbye.
Sure, and fantastic presentation, Joe. And
oh, hello. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah. I think we
okay, yeah.
thought maybe we lost Charles for a minute there.
Yeah.
We did. Charles
Okay.
dropped off. Looks like I think we lost him. He has, once in a while, he has a cell phone error.
Oh.
When you made that comment about having that technical difficulty, that's why I always keep, you know, joking. I can't wait for my self-driving car while I'm trapped in the back seat of that thing. Nothing's going to ever go amiss. Yes. The little scary thought. Anyway, I would definitely thank you. I know just off the top of my head that we've got Bob Poole coming up, which is pretty interesting because, you know, for most people that have been on this call, potentially they know a lot about it, but he's been in the thick of this transportation mentality for a really long time, especially when it comes to cars and freeways and who owns and are there tolls and is it market-based, you know, based on the hour of the day and the rest of it. And so much of it's coming to fruition, what he predicted and said we need to do. And this is just in that same realm, frankly. So it's going to be an important theme, and if we can get over on some of these areas, boy, the place is going to be a lot better because it puts more of us individually in control again. And I know that's been Trump's kind of push, you know, love him or hate him, but it's been kind of his mantra, and that's really what it boils down to once again. So I appreciate you bringing this to our attention today and making us aware of it yet again, of how important it is for us to be personally involved. We're definitely going to want to reconnect, Joe, and see what we can find out. Maybe we can get some more stuff going in California for each other.
Yeah, great idea.
Now, for anybody who wants to follow up with you or anything, is there like a membership to your organization, or what's kind of the way you could leave everybody that they can do something besides just sending a couple bucks in or what have you?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you just Google Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, you'll find us. And like I said, we're for a long time we were the only ones working on this issue besides Michael Hansen, and he also lives in Hawaii. So and now it's starting to gain fire. So yeah, if you'd like to visit us or learn more, you can read our reports at grassrootinstitute.org.
Very good. And I know you got a good PDF that I saw earlier about the Jones Act they can download from that site. So that's a really good informative piece. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I will see you in the next week. And again, look Monday for the notice coming out to tell you about the next one coming up, and then a link to this particular one with a few little best ofs buried near the bottom there. So appreciate that, and definitely spread the word around on some others coming to this. And we will see you next week.
Thank you.